Stripped to its bare mechanical essentials, Max Payne 3 is about ripping through rooms, choreographing stylish gunfights based around the strengths and limitations of your environments. It's the simple set of tools executed with such thorough detail that makes it so satisfying. The precision of the aiming, the considered animations and euphoria physics, the audio-visual cues, and ferocity of each weapon make every gunfight a rippingly violent orchestra of debris and gunshots, all filtered through bullet time. It's the forefront example of style elevating simplicity, and the two going hand in hand to create a tightly designed and tense action experience, where no second in a gunfight is wasted. This comes through in the level design and how well the game keeps pushing Max into new locations to do the thing he does best. From nightclubs to back alley bars and the streets of Hoboken to the docks and favelas of Sao Paulo, the campaign is defined by each and every one of its levels being aesthetically and tonally different from the last. It helps the game's overall pacing feel unique within its genre, because you cover a lot of changing ground and as such the journey feels substantial, yet the story is gripped tight enough to never bloat at the seams and ends right where it needs to. There's not a trace of an element wasted, and the game fires on all cylinders throughout. The pace of the story reflects the best pace to approach the combat. As the strands of conspiracy unravel at each turn, Max has no time in the plot to stop and think, only react. And the combat is best enjoyed in a similar way. Max is best utilised as a wrecking ball of destruction, shooting down enemies like bowling pins. There's a cover system, but hunkering down underutilises your more substantial options, bullet time and shoot dodging. While it is true the monumental arsenal of the previous games has been pared down, this change places a greater focus on heightening the pace of gunfights. You spend less time fiddling around with the 800 different types of machine gun in your breast pocket and are instead working your way through fights a lot quicker. At its best, there's barely a moment between the final kill cam of one group of enemies and the first shot put between the eyes of the next. Bullet time also becomes a more substantial asset here. Your allowance is generous, and thus liberal use of it becomes a necessary tool to outmaneuver enemies, which so often outnumber and outgun you. As such, cover is best used as a brief respite from the action to pop a painkiller or reload, rather than being the basis of your approach to gunfights. Perhaps Rockstar could have communicated this a lot more effectively. About all there is to tell you should be using cover sparingly is its often destructible nature, and the fact enemies can aggressively push up to you if you get too comfy. These present as neat details and just good AI rather than the push a player needs towards playing the game in its intended and more enjoyable way. It reminds me of the problem Dark Souls faced when hiding behind a shield became the dominant strategy, and a safe space for a lot of players to remain without trying the many other options available. It's practically the reason Bloodborne exists without such a defensive option. Max Payne 3 as a 2012 release is fighting against the preconceived notion that a third-person shooter released at the time was automatically assumed to be cover-based. I think if there is one big design fault of the game, it's the fact it doesn't push against this preconception hard enough to spotlight its more unique approach to combat that is actually very in keeping with the design of the original games. In fact, it feels like the cover system only exists so the cutscenes can be fair about where they place Max into the middle of a fight. Starting off behind a concrete pillar where you can't as easily get hit is much fairer than if the game left you out to dry in the middle of a room surrounded on all sides. Aside from these instances, the game is most enjoyable when you pretend the cover system basically doesn't exist and can end up tearing through rooms in seconds.
I know you brought a fucking army down here, but there ain't much left. Joe!
Rockstar's trademark attention to detail, applied to a more focused, linear experience, brings about a bar for production quality only matched by the likes of Naughty Dog. Even so, Max Payne 3 is perhaps the best version of a simple action game elevated by such details. At first, it's the overt touches, such as its overall fidelity and punchy, weighty physics engine. Then you pick up on the slighter intricacies that feed into the controls. Max's 360-degree movement animations whilst moving gives the shooting a sense of fluidity and precision, which translates to the moments Max is on the ground too. The placement of enemies is just as considered and can be memorised and factored into the choreography of a level's approach, meaning you can often sweep through a combat sequence like you're stringing together a fighting game combo. It's further details like the roll Max does when picking up a new weapon on the fly which retains the pace of movement, his reaction to impacting surfaces after a shoot dodge, the modelling of every bullet as a projectile in real time, making them avoidable when the game slows down. The list goes on, and even with superfluous visual details, the stubble of Max's newly shaved head grows back over the course of the last few levels as his scars heal too. The fact Portuguese isn't translated, so if you're not fluent, you're just as alienated as Max is from the conversations around you. It all compiles into a deeply considered and handcrafted experience that is satisfying because of its overall execution.
Sir, let us handle this. You stay in your office, lock yourself in. Do not answer the door unless you know it's me.
What's going on?
Nothing to worry about, everything's fine. Get down behind the desk, now, both of you.
You could dwell on the superficial differences from the earlier games, but the fact remains most of what made the original game thematically rich remains in Max Payne 3. Like the first, it begins where it ends. There's a political conspiracy, gang and drug violence, police corruption, personal betrayals, and the spotlighting of a society's dark undergrowth through the hard-boiled narration of our familiar protagonist, Max, who wholeheartedly acknowledges the fact that he seems to keep finding himself in the same situations.
Another dark, rainy night. Another police station. Another futile crusade for amends. Time moves forward. Nothing changes.
The broad underpinnings of the noir style remain, only with an overt aesthetic change, born from the geographical shift swapping the frostbitten nights of New York to a sun-drenched Brazil. Cinematically, noir has made such a shift before, from the classical era of the 40s and 50s giving way to a resurgence of the themes and ideas resurfacing within 70s neo-noir, again with aesthetic changes. Films such as Chinatown and The Long Goodbye forego the black and white low-key lighting of the classic period for more vivid palettes suitable for their time. The warm colours of both films' Californian settings contrasting with tradition is an apt reflection of Max Payne's shift to Brazil, and sees it at least within the precedent of its genre. There's also a deeper argument as to why noir as a genre is fleeting in itself, but I'll leave that to be explored in the dissertation of some film student somewhere. What matters is that Max Payne 3 takes the narrative motivation of the previous games and develops it without disregarding it.
Back home, it was time for some R&R, the only way I knew how.
It begins with Max himself, his character now looking at life through the blurry lens of an empty whiskey glass. He's arrived at the natural conclusion of his fictional type, an action hero now fallen and impaled by addiction and self-loathing. As much as the premise is taken seriously by Rockstar, Max's hard-boiled narration is also a side dish of pitch-black humour that is laced within his cynical delivery. For every hard-to-swallow, gritty genre element comes a sour comment from Max to chase it down with. Rockstar's MO for satire also drifts in and out of the game. It's through characters such as Marcello that the tonal link to the developer is most felt. He feels like a GTA character, an ignoramus completely unaware of how much of a fraud he comes across as. It's entertaining to see Max see right through him, but also encounter characters in optional cutscenes that are straight out of Rockstar's wheelhouse. I think it goes underappreciated when discussions about the tone arise. While it's not as overtly tongue-in-cheek as Remedy's approach, it still acknowledges its own tropes and ensures Max is fully aware of the ironies around it and of himself.
I'd been sitting at the bar for 3 hours, or about 5 years, depending on how you looked at things. I tried not to look at things.
It's a continued thread of the original games, the examination of Max as an archetype in the middle of a genre story. In fact, some of the well-worn cliches of his character are the very things exploited within the plot to set him up for a downfall. However, the story pivots and Max gets about as good as a shot as his situation allows him to do some good in the face of bad odds. Max Payne 3 is by no means a subtle game. In fact, it often draws much attention to its unsubtlety. Yet within its own canon, it works because the entries before it were never really about subtlety either. They're gritty pulp novels you'd find for a few quid in a second-hand bookshop, and the third is just as content with being so too. Only it makes damn sure to be just about the most polished and punchy presentation of such an experience.
¡No hay nadie aquí! ¡Esta también está vacía! ¡Encontré a uno de ellos!
In the same way that the mechanics are elevated by the surrounding detail, the story is enhanced by its presentational techniques. Max's state of mind visually adorns the cutscenes with blown out, searing lights and chromatic distortions, giving the sense of a perpetual hangover clouding the details. Match cuts scrape the past and present together in hazy recollection, and the quality of the voice performances ground the characters in their convictions. The crunchy industrial sounds of the health-produced soundtrack are just as responsible for delivering on the tonal peaks and troughs throughout the game. Hard-hitting drums and clashing metal electronica inject power into many shootouts. Yet there's also the sad nights Max spends alone in his apartment drinking, which are lent a solemn mood track which settles the tone just as well. It straddles the line between music and sound design to settle firmly as an essential element, contributing to the experience's overall texture, and concludes it as a seriously well-produced game.
Escape was a weird sort of compliment, but one I didn't need.
As the ending of a trilogy coming nearly a decade after its previous installment, Max Payne 3 is underrated in its firm grasp of what makes its namesake so memorable. It develops the thematic underpinnings of the previous games with a fresh aesthetic focus, and doesn't concede to the mechanical trends of its time, maintaining a simple yet satisfying mix of old school sensibilities enhanced with the modern levels of high budget, detail oriented execution. That's its key strength, using new technology not to change its fundamentals but enhance them and shape them up to a higher standard. As a Max Payne game, it's more than worthy. As a piece of neo-noir fiction, it's firmly placed. As a shooter, it's peerless, with arguably the tightest and most satisfyingly executed controls of its genre.